You're 28 years old, healthy as a horse, crushing deadlines at your dream job in downtown Chicago. Then suddenly, your chest feels like someone's driving a red-hot poker through your ribcage. You collapse at your desk, gasping for air, while your colleagues scramble to call 911. The paramedics arrive, and in that terrifying moment when you think you might die, they ask for your emergency contacts. You give them your family's numbers, certain they'll rush to your side. But they don't come. Instead, the person who holds your hand in that sterile hospital room, who stays through the night, who becomes your lifeline when your own blood abandons you, is someone you barely knew 6 months ago. Someone who proves that family isn't always about shared DNA, but about who shows up when the world falls apart. This is my story. My name is Isabel Half, and this is how a heart attack at 28 taught me the difference between the family you're born with and the family you choose. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never thought much about mortality at 28. Death was something that happened to other people, older people, sick people, people who didn't drink green smoothies every morning and hit the gym 4 times a week like I did. My biggest concerns were whether I'd get the promotion I'd been eyeing at Richardson and Associates Marketing, and if I'd ever find someone worth dating in a city full of commitment-phobic millennials. My life in Chicago was exactly what I dreamed of during those suffocating years growing up in small-town Nebraska. I had a corner apartment in Lincoln Park with exposed brick walls and windows that caught the morning sun. I could walk to work along Lake Michigan, stopping at my favorite coffee shop where Marcus, the barista, knew my order by heart. Medium oat milk latte, extra shot, dash of cinnamon. Simple pleasures that made me feel like I had finally made it. Richardson and Associates occupied 3 floors of a sleek glass building in the Loop. I'd landed there straight out of Northwestern's graduate program, one of only 12 candidates selected from over 300 applicants. The company specialized in digital marketing for Fortune 500 clients, and I was part of their emerging technologies division, the team responsible for staying ahead of trends and implementing cutting-edge strategies. My days typically started at 7:30 a.m. and rarely ended before 8 p.m. I thrived on the pace, the pressure, the constant challenge of solving complex problems for clients who expected miracles. My cubicle sat in an open-plan space filled with ambitious 20-somethings and seasoned professionals, all united by our dedication to excellence and our addiction to the free espresso machine. The office culture was exactly what you'd expect from a high-end marketing firm. Competitive but collaborative, demanding but rewarding. We had ping-pong tournaments during lunch breaks, mandatory fun happy hours every Friday, and a company retreat to Wisconsin Dells each summer where everyone pretended to enjoy team-building exercises while getting quietly drunk on company-sponsored wine. I kept my personal life separate from work, mostly. My colleagues knew the basics. I was from Nebraska, had graduated from Northwestern, lived alone with my cat named Hemingway. What they didn't know was how strained my relationship with my parents had become since I'd moved to Chicago 5 years earlier. My parents, Robert and Linda Hoff, still lived in the same house where I'd grown up in Kearney, Nebraska. Population 33,000 and shrinking. Dad worked at the grain elevator, the same job he'd held for 32 years. Mom taught 3rd grade at the elementary school I had attended as a child. They were good people, salt-of-the-earth types, who believed in hard work, church on Sundays, and the inherent suspicion that anything beyond Nebraska's borders was probably dangerous. They'd never understood my decision to leave. In their minds, I'd abandoned everything that mattered. Family, community, tradition, to chase some fantasy life in a city full of strangers. Our phone calls had dwindled from weekly to monthly, then to holidays and birthdays. When I did visit, which was maybe twice a year, the conversations felt stilted, full of unspoken disappointments and misunderstandings.
My older brother Jake had stayed in Kearney, married his high school girlfriend Sarah, and taken over Dad's insurance agency. They had 2 kids, my nephew Tommy, age 6, and my niece Emma, age 4, whom I barely knew despite sending birthday presents and Christmas gifts every year. Jake made it clear he thought I was selfish for leaving, though he never said it directly. It came through in comments about how some people think they're too good for small towns and questions about when I was going to come to my senses and move back home. My younger sister Ashley had moved to Omaha after college, a compromise that kept her close enough for regular family dinners, but far enough away to feel independent. She worked as a nurse at Nebraska Medical Center and served as the family diplomat, always trying to smooth over the tension between me and my parents. Ashley was the only one who seemed to understand why I'd left, though she'd never had the courage to venture beyond Nebraska herself. The distance wasn't just geographical. Over the years, I'd evolved into someone my family didn't recognize. I'd developed tastes for Ethiopian food and independent films, opinions on urban planning and sustainable energy, friends from 6 different countries who spoke 3 different languages. When I went home, I felt like an anthropologist studying a culture I used to belong to, but no longer understood.
Work became my refuge, the place where I felt most myself. My colleagues appreciated my ideas, respected my expertise, and never made me feel guilty for wanting more than a predictable life in a small town. I'd built a professional identity that felt authentic and meaningful, even if it meant sacrificing the easy comfort of family approval. At Richardson and Associates, I'd quickly established myself as someone who could handle high-pressure clients and impossible deadlines. My specialty was social media crisis management, helping companies navigate public relations disasters in the digital age. It was challenging work that required quick thinking, strategic planning, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. Skills that, as it turned out, would serve me well in ways I never could have imagined. My closest work relationship was with David Chen, a senior account manager who'd been at the firm for 8 years. David was brilliant, funny, and refreshingly drama-free, a rare combination in our industry. We'd collaborated on several major campaigns, and I'd come to respect his judgment and appreciate his dry sense of humor. He was one of the few people at work who knew anything about my family situation, though I'd only shared the basics during a late-night conversation after a particularly brutal client presentation. There was also Maria Rodriguez, a fellow junior associate who'd started 6 months after me. Maria was everything I wasn't: outgoing, spontaneous, and completely comfortable with uncertainty. She'd grown up in Los Angeles, spoke fluent Mandarin and passable Mandarin, and had an infectious laugh that could brighten even the most stressful days. We'd bonded over our shared experience of being young women in a male-dominated industry, though our approaches to handling that challenge were completely different. My daily routine was precise and comforting. I'd wake up at 6 a.m., spend 30 minutes doing yoga in my living room while Hemingway watched skeptically from his perch on the windowsill. After a quick shower, I'd prepare my green smoothie: spinach, banana, berries, protein powder, and almond milk, while checking emails on my phone. The walk to work took exactly 18 minutes, giving me time to listen to podcasts about marketing trends or personal development. At the office, I'd arrive before most of my colleagues, using the quiet morning hours to tackle my most demanding projects. I was working on 3 major accounts at the time: a sustainable clothing brand trying to recover from a supply chain scandal, a tech startup launching a new app for remote workers, and a pharmaceutical company dealing with negative coverage about drug pricing. Each required a different approach, but all demanded the same attention to detail and strategic thinking that had become my professional trademark. Lunch was usually eaten at my desk while reviewing client materials or attending conference calls with team members in other time zones. I joined a gym 2 blocks from the office, and I tried to squeeze in workouts 3 or 4 times a week.
though deadline pressures sometimes made that impossible. Evenings were spent either working late, meeting friends for dinner, or collapsing on my couch with takeout and Netflix. It was a good life, even if it was sometimes lonely. I'd built something meaningful in Chicago, a career, an identity, a sense of purpose that felt entirely my own. I had acquaintances who might become friends given time, colleagues who respected my work, and a cat who provided unconditional love in exchange for premium wet food and regular chin scratches. What I didn't have was the kind of deep, unshakable support system that I'd taken for granted growing up. The knowledge that if something terrible happened, people who truly knew me would drop everything to be by my side. I'd traded that security for independence, and most days it felt like a fair exchange. Most days. I had no way of knowing that in just a few short weeks, that trade-off would be tested in ways I never could have imagined. That the carefully constructed life I'd built would be stripped away in a matter of minutes, leaving me completely vulnerable and utterly dependent on the kindness of people who barely knew me. But that Tuesday morning in March, as I walked to work along the lakefront path, breathing in the crisp air and watching the sunrise paint the water gold, I felt nothing but gratitude for the life I'd chosen. I was exactly where I wanted to be, doing exactly what I wanted to do, answerable to no one but myself. Sometimes, the universe has a twisted sense of humor about timing.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The first sign something was wrong came on a Thursday afternoon in late March, during what should have been a routine client presentation. I was standing in conference room B, clicking through slides about social media engagement metrics for a pharmaceutical client, when a strange tightness gripped my chest. Not pain, exactly, more like someone was slowly turning a vise around my ribcage. I paused mid-sentence, one hand instinctively moving to my sternum. The client, a stern-faced woman named Patricia Wellington from Morrison Pharmaceuticals, looked at me with barely concealed impatience. "Miss Half, are you having technical difficulties?" "No, sorry," I managed, forcing a professional smile. "Just a moment of heartburn, I think. Too much coffee this morning." The sensation faded as quickly as it had come, and I continued with the presentation. But something about that moment stuck with me, the way my body had suddenly felt foreign, unreliable. Over the next few days, similar episodes occurred sporadically. A flutter of anxiety during a conference call with our tech startup client, shortness of breath while climbing the stairs to the third floor instead of waiting for the elevator, a strange fatigue that no amount of green smoothies or gym sessions seemed to cure. I chalked it up to stress. We were in the middle of our busiest quarter, and I'd been pulling 12-hour days for weeks. The pharmaceutical account alone was consuming most of my bandwidth. Morrison Pharmaceuticals was facing a congressional investigation into their pricing practices for diabetes medication, and the media coverage was brutal. Patricia Wellington had hired Richardson and Associates to rehabilitate their public image, a task that felt increasingly impossible as new damaging stories emerged daily. "We need a complete digital overhaul," Patricia had told me during our first meeting. "New messaging, aggressive counter-narratives, influencer partnerships, whatever it takes to shift public opinion." Her expectations were astronomical, her timeline was impossible, and her budget was surprisingly modest for the scope of work she was demanding. I'd assembled a team of 5 people to tackle different aspects of the campaign. David Chen was handling traditional media outreach, working his contacts at major newspapers and magazines. Maria Rodriguez was managing our social media response, crafting messages that walked the delicate line between corporate responsibility and brand protection. 2 junior associates were monitoring online conversations and preparing daily sentiment reports. The strategy we developed was sophisticated but risky. Instead of defensive messaging, we were going on the offensive, highlighting Morrison's research and development investments, their patient assistance programs, and their contributions to medical breakthroughs. We were positioning them not as corporate villains, but as innovators being unfairly targeted by politicians looking for easy scapegoats.
It was the kind of high-stakes project that could make or break careers. Success would establish me as someone who could handle impossible clients and deliver miraculous results. Failure would mark me as overambitious and underqualified, probably ending my trajectory toward the senior associate position I was hoping to secure by year end. The pressure was exhilarating and exhausting in equal measure. I was living on 4 hours of sleep, surviving on espresso and adrenaline, constantly connected to my phone in case of breaking news or client emergencies. My personal life had essentially disappeared. I had canceled 3 dinner plans with friends, missed my nephew's birthday party, attending via FaceTime instead, and hadn't been to the gym in 2 weeks. My apartment had become a secondary office with client files spread across my dining table and my laptop permanently stationed on the kitchen counter. Hemingway expressed his displeasure by knocking papers off surfaces and sitting on my keyboard during important video calls, but even his passive-aggressive protests couldn't slow me down. The Morrison account was just one of several major projects demanding attention. The sustainable clothing brand EcoThread was preparing to launch a transparency initiative that required careful coordination with environmental advocacy groups. The tech startup, ConnectSpace, was facing their own crisis after a data breach that had exposed user information, and they needed immediate damage control strategies. Each client required a different expertise, a different voice, a different approach. With EcoThread, I was the environmentally conscious millennial advocating for corporate responsibility. With ConnectSpace, I was the tech-savvy problem solver focused on user trust and security improvements. With Morrison Pharmaceuticals, I was the strategic communications expert balancing public health concerns with business realities. The constant code switching was mentally exhausting, but it was also professionally thrilling. I was developing skills and insights that would have taken years to acquire in a more traditional career path. Every day brought new challenges that pushed me to think creatively, work collaboratively, and perform under pressure. My colleagues had begun to notice my workload and offer help, though I was reluctant to accept it. David had volunteered to take over the ConnectSpace account entirely, arguing that he had more experience with tech company crisis management. Maria had suggested bringing in a freelancer to help with the Morrison social media monitoring, pointing out that we were all stretched too thin to do quality work.
Isabel, you're going to burn out, Maria warned me during a rare shared lunch break. I've seen it happen to other people here. You start strong, take on too much, and then crash spectacularly. It's not worth it. But I couldn't slow down, not when I was so close to proving myself. The senior associate position came with a significant salary increase, equity participation, and the kind of professional recognition I'd been working towards since graduate school. More importantly, it would validate my decision to leave Nebraska, to build a life on my own terms, to prioritize career advancement over family expectations. The irony wasn't lost on me that my success was directly proportional to my isolation from the people who'd raised me. The more professionally accomplished I became, the less I had in common with my family. The more independent I grew, the more I realized how much I'd given up to achieve that independence. My last conversation with my parents had been 2 weeks earlier, a stilted 15-minute phone call that covered the weather in both Chicago and Nebraska, updates on my nephew and niece, and my mother's concerns about my apparent weight loss in the photos I'd posted on social media. They'd asked about work in the vague way people ask about things they don't understand, and I'd given equally vague responses about big projects and exciting opportunities. Ashley had texted a few days later, mentioning that Mom was worried about me looking too thin and too tired in recent photos. I dismissed the concern with a laughing emoji and a message about being crazy busy but loving it. The truth was, I hadn't looked closely at myself in weeks. My morning routine had been reduced to the bare essentials: shower, dress, grab coffee, get to the office. Self-reflection was a luxury I couldn't afford. The Thursday when everything changed started like any other. I arrived at the office at 7:15 a.m., 30 minutes before my first conference call with the ConnectSpace legal team. The building was mostly empty except for security guards and the cleaning crew finishing their overnight shift. I loved these quiet morning moments when the office felt like a sanctuary devoted entirely to productivity and possibility.
My desk was organized chaos, multiple monitors displaying different client dashboards, sticky notes covering every available surface, 3 coffee cups in various stages of consumption. I'd developed a system for managing the complexity, but it would have looked like madness to anyone else. Color-coded folders for each client, separate browsers for different social media accounts, notification systems that helped me track breaking news across multiple industries. The ConnectSpace call went well. Their legal team had approved our proposed messaging around the data breach, and we were cleared to begin implementing our reputation recovery strategy. I'd scheduled a follow-up meeting with their CEO for the following week to discuss long-term brand positioning, and I could sense their growing confidence in our approach. After the call, I dove into Morrison Pharmaceuticals' work. Patricia Wellington had sent a 2 a.m. email with new concerns about an upcoming congressional hearing, and she wanted revised talking points that addressed specific questions their executives might face. The timeline was aggressive. She needed preliminary drafts by noon, final versions by 5 p.m., and a complete media training package by Monday morning. I was deep in research mode, reviewing congressional testimony from similar pharmaceutical hearings, when the first wave of real pain hit. Not the mild discomfort that I'd been experiencing for days, but something sharp and insistent that made me gasp audibly. My hand flew to my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't catch my breath. The sensation passed quickly, but it left me shaken. This wasn't stress or heartburn or too much caffeine. This was something else entirely. Something that made my body feel like it was betraying me in ways I didn't understand. I glanced around the office, which was starting to fill with my colleagues. David was at his desk, already on a phone call with what sounded like a difficult client. Maria was reviewing social media reports while eating what appeared to be leftover pizza for breakfast. Everything looked normal, ordinary, exactly as it should be. But something fundamental had shifted. In that moment of sharp, inexplicable pain, I'd gotten a preview of vulnerability I'd never experienced before. The realization that my body, which I'd always taken for granted, might not be as reliable as I had assumed. That my carefully constructed life, built on the foundation of my own health and energy and competence, might be more fragile than I'd ever considered. I tried to focus on the Morrison talking points, but part of my attention was now devoted to monitoring my own physical state. Every breath, every heartbeat, every sensation became suspect. Was that tightness in my chest normal? Had I always felt slightly dizzy after climbing stairs? When was the last time I'd felt truly, completely well? The questions were distracting and terrifying in equal measure, because if something was genuinely wrong with me, I wasn't sure who would be there to help me figure out what to do next. That realization hit me harder than the chest pain had. I was 28 years old, successful and independent, and completely alone in a city of 3 million people. I had colleagues who respected my work, friends who enjoyed my company, and family members who loved me from a distance, but I didn't have anyone who would drop everything to take care of me if I couldn't take care of myself. For the first time since moving to Chicago, I wondered if the price of independence might be higher than I'd ever imagined.
The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything, though I didn't know it at the time. Instead of acknowledging that something might be seriously wrong with my body, I decided to push harder. The chest pain episodes were becoming more frequent, but I convinced myself they were psychosomatic, my body's way of processing the intense pressure I was under. The solution wasn't medical attention. It was proving to myself that I could handle anything. I arrived at the office at 6:45 a.m., earlier than ever, carrying a large coffee and a sense of grim determination. The Morrison Pharmaceuticals presentation was scheduled for 2 p.m., and I'd spent most of the previous night refining our strategy. Patricia Wellington expected nothing short of a miracle, a comprehensive plan that would somehow transform her company from public enemy number one into a sympathetic healthcare innovator. The presentation materials were spread across 3 different conference tables.
PowerPoint slides detailing our recommended messaging strategy, social media mock-ups showing how we'd reshape online conversations, a detailed timeline for rolling out initiatives over the next 6 months, crisis communication protocols for when, not if, the next wave of bad news hit. David arrived at 7:30 a.m. and found me color-coding printed pages with highlighters. My 4th cup of coffee already half empty. "Jesus, Isabel, did you sleep here?" He looked genuinely concerned, which was unusual for him. David was typically all business, focused on results, rather than personal well-being. "Close to it," I admitted, "but look at this." I walked him through the presentation, pointing out the strategic elements I was most proud of. We're not just defending Morrison, we're repositioning the entire narrative around pharmaceutical innovation. Instead of letting them be the villain, we make them the hero fighting government overreach. David studied the materials with professional appreciation, but his expression remained troubled. "This is brilliant work, really, but you look like hell. When was the last time you had a proper meal or slept more than 4 hours?" Before I could answer, Maria arrived with her usual energy and a box of donuts from the bakery downstairs. "Emergency sugar delivery," she announced, then stopped short when she saw me. "Whoa, Isabel, you're scaring me. You're like gray." I caught my reflection in the conference room windows. She wasn't wrong. My skin had taken on a waxy pallor that no amount of concealer could hide. Dark circles under my eyes made me look older than my 28 years old, but I felt energized, focused, ready to tackle the biggest presentation of my career. "I'm fine," I insisted, grabbing a donut to prove the point. "Just running on adrenaline. You know how it is during crunch time." What I didn't tell them was that the chest pain had evolved overnight. Instead of sharp, isolated episodes, I was now experiencing a constant, low-level pressure like someone had placed a weight on my sternum that I couldn't remove. My left arm ached in a way that felt connected to my chest, though I couldn't explain the sensation logically. I'd Googled my symptoms at 3 a.m., which was a mistake. The internet suggested everything from anxiety attacks to heart disease, with a dozen terrifying possibilities in between. But at 28, with no family history of heart problems, cardiac issues seemed impossible. I was more likely to be struck by lightning than to have a heart attack at my age. The morning flew by in a blur of final preparations. I rehearsed my presentation 3 times, timing each section to ensure we stayed within our allotted hour. I prepared answers for the 20 most likely questions Patricia might ask. I created backup slides for alternative scenarios, contingency plans for different budget levels, and detailed timelines that accounted for every possible variable. By noon, I was as ready as I'd ever been for anything in my professional life. The materials were flawless, the strategy was sound, and my confidence was unshakable. This presentation would either establish me as Richardson and Associates' rising star, or prove that I'd bitten off more than I could chew.
Patricia Wellington arrived 15 minutes early, accompanied by 2 colleagues I hadn't met before, Marcus Thompson, Morrison's Vice President of Corporate Communications, and Dr. Sarah Chen, their Chief Medical Officer. Patricia introduced them with minimal warmth, making it clear that my performance would be evaluated by committee rather than individual judgment. "Miss Half," Patricia said as we settled into Conference Room A, "I hope you understand the gravity of our situation. Morrison Pharmaceuticals is facing an existential crisis. The congressional hearing is just the beginning. We're looking at potential federal investigation, class action lawsuits, and complete erosion of consumer trust. What you present today needs to be nothing short of transformational." The pressure was intoxicating. This was the moment I'd been working toward since my first day at Richardson and Associates. The chance to prove that I could handle the most demanding clients and deliver impossible results. Everything I'd sacrificed, every relationship I'd strained, every personal priority I'd postponed had led to this room, this presentation, this opportunity to validate my choices. I started with our situational analysis, walking them through the current media landscape surrounding pharmaceutical pricing. The charts and graphs painted a brutal picture. Morrison's reputation scores had plummeted 67% in 6 months. Their stock price had dropped 23%, and online sentiment was 89% negative. But instead of dwelling on the problems, I used the data to set up our solution. The challenge isn't that people hate Morrison Pharmaceuticals, I explained, clicking to my next slide. The challenge is that people don't understand what Morrison Pharmaceuticals actually does. You're not just a company that sets drug prices. You're a research institution, a medical innovator, a partner in healthcare advancement. Our job is to remind people of that reality. The strategy I outlined was comprehensive and bold. Phase 1 involved immediate crisis management, strategic media interviews, social media campaigns highlighting patient success stories, partnerships with medical advocacy groups. Phase 2 focused on long-term reputation building, research transparency initiatives, expanded patient assistance programs, visible investments in breakthrough treatments. Phase 3 was the most ambitious, positioning Morrison as the pharmaceutical industry's voice of reform. Instead of defending high drug prices, we'd lead the conversation about sustainable innovation funding. Instead of hiding from congressional scrutiny, we'd propose our own industry standards and advocate for regulatory changes that protected both patients and research investments. "You want to make us the good guys," Marcus Thompson said, his tone skeptical, "after months of being portrayed as corporate villains." "I want to make you the truth tellers," I corrected. "The company brave enough to explain how pharmaceutical development actually does, transparent enough to show your real costs and investments, innovative enough to propose solutions instead of just defending problems." Dr. Chen leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. "What about the timeline? Congressional hearings don't wait for reputation management campaigns." This was where months of preparation paid off. I had detailed implementation schedules, media placement strategies, content calendars that synchronize with legislative schedules. Every element of the campaign was designed to build momentum leading up to the congressional testimony, creating a narrative framework that would influence how that testimony was received and interpreted. The presentation lasted 90 minutes. I fielded questions about budget allocation, timeline feasibility, risk assessment, and competitive analysis. Every answer drew on research I'd conducted, precedents I'd studied, strategies I'd developed specifically for their unique situation. I felt like a surgeon performing a complex operation. Every move was precise, purposeful, designed to achieve a specific outcome. When I finished, the room fell silent. Patricia exchanged looks with her colleagues, and I could sense them processing the scoop and ambition of what I'd proposed. This wasn't just a communications campaign. It was a complete corporate transformation, a fundamental shift in how Morrison Pharmaceuticals engaged with the world. "Ms. Hoff," Patricia finally said, "this is exactly the kind of thinking we need. Bold, comprehensive, strategically sound. When can you start implementation?" The relief and triumph I felt in that moment was overwhelming. Months of preparation, weeks of 18-hour days, countless sacrificed personal commitments, all validated in a single question. I'd not only met Patricia's impossible expectations, I'd exceeded them. "We can begin phase 1 immediately. I'll have detailed project timelines and team assignments ready by Monday morning, and we can start media outreach by Wednesday." As they gathered their materials to leave, Dr. Chen approached me privately. "I have to ask, are you feeling all right? You look quite pale." The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on professional performance that I'd forgotten about my physical state entirely. "Just tired," I said, with what I hoped was a convincing smile. "Long hours preparing for this presentation." She nodded, but her expression remained concerned. "Well, get some rest. Projects like this require stamina, and you can't sustain this pace indefinitely." After they left, I sat alone in the conference room, surrounded by my presentation materials and the lingering scent of Patricia's expensive perfume. I'd done it. I'd secured the biggest account of my career, proven my worth to the most demanding client I'd ever encountered, and positioned myself for the promotion I'd been working toward for 2 years. The chest pressure that had been my constant companion all morning intensified suddenly, forcing me to grip the edge of the conference table. But instead of worry, I felt only satisfaction. This discomfort, whatever it was, had been worth it. I'd pushed through physical limitations to achieve professional excellence exactly the way successful people were supposed to do. I had no idea that my body was trying to warn me about something far more serious than stress, that the commitment I just made to Patricia Wellington would become impossible to fulfill, that the career I just advanced would become the least important thing in my world. All I knew was that I'd won. I'd proven that I could handle anything, overcome any obstacle, achieve any goal through sheer determination and professional excellence. The pain in my chest was just the price of success, and I was more than willing to pay it.
The first sign that my perfect plan was about to collapse came at 8:17 a.m. on Monday morning, exactly 73 hours after my triumphant presentation to Patricia Wellington. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing the Morrison implementation timeline I had promised to deliver, when my computer screen suddenly seemed to shimmer and blur at the edges. I blinked hard, assuming it was eye strain from too many late nights staring at monitors. But when my vision cleared, I realized the problem wasn't with my eyes, it was with my ability to concentrate. The detailed project timeline I'd been working on for the past hour looked like gibberish. Tasks I had carefully organized the night before no longer made logical sense. Deadlines I'd calculated and recalculated seemed randomly assigned. This was more than exhaustion. This was my mind refusing to function at the level I demanded of it, and the timing couldn't have been worse. Patricia Wellington expected detailed project materials by noon, and 3 other clients had urgent requests that required immediate attention. The sustainable clothing brand, EcoThread, was facing a new supply chain controversy. ConnectSpace was dealing with follow-up questions about their data breach, and a potential new client, a renewable energy startup, was coming in for a pitch meeting at 2 p.m. I stood up from my desk, hoping that movement would clear my head, and immediately felt dizzy. Not the mild lightheadedness I had been experiencing for days, but a genuine sensation that the floor was tilting beneath my feet. I gripped the edge of my cubicle wall, waiting for the feeling to pass, trying to look casual in case any colleagues were watching. "Isabel?" Maria's voice came from the cubicle behind mine. "You okay over there?" "Fine," I called back, though my voice sounded strangely hoarse. "Just thinking through some complex logistics." The truth was, I couldn't think through anything. The cognitive sharpness that had always been my professional superpower seemed to have abandoned me completely. Simple tasks that should have taken minutes were requiring enormous effort and producing mediocre results. Email responses that normally flowed effortlessly now took multiple drafts to sound coherent. I made it through the morning by relying on work I'd already completed. The Morrison timeline was mostly finished. I just needed to polish the formatting and add a few final details. The EcoThread response could wait until after lunch. ConnectSpace's questions were straightforward enough that I could handle them on autopilot. And a potential new client, a renewable energy startup, was coming in for a pitch meeting at 2 p.m. I was now staring at my blank laptop screen, realizing I couldn't even remember the potential client's name, let alone their specific needs and challenges. By 11:30 a.m., panic was setting in. Not the energizing kind of pressure that usually motivated my best work, but a genuine fear that I was about to fail spectacularly in front of multiple clients on the same day. My hands were shaking as I typed, and I had developed a persistent cough that seemed to come from deep in my chest. David appeared at my cubicle with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression. "You had Maria tell me you've been acting weird all morning. What's going on?" I looked up at him, and for a moment I considered telling the truth, that I felt like my body and mind were betraying me simultaneously, that the success I had achieved on Friday suddenly felt impossible to sustain, that I was scared in a way I'd never experienced before. Instead, I said, "Just fighting off some kind of bug, I think. Nothing serious." "Have you eaten anything today?" he asked, studying my face with the kind of attention usually reserved for difficult client problems. I tried to remember. Coffee, definitely. multiple cups, but actual food? The donut Maria had brought Friday might have been my last solid meal. The thought of eating made my stomach clench unpleasantly. "I'll grab something after I finish these Morrison materials," I promised. David didn't look convinced, but he didn't push the issue. "Let me know if you need help with anything, and maybe consider going home early today. You look like you're about to collapse." After he left, I forced myself to focus on the renewable energy pitch meeting. The company was called Solar Bridge Technologies, and they were developing innovative battery storage solutions for residential solar systems. Their challenge was differentiating themselves in an increasingly crowded market while communicating complex technical benefits to non-technical consumers. Under normal circumstances, this would have been an engaging puzzle. I enjoyed working with startups, especially in emerging technology sectors. The combination of innovation, ambition, and resource constraints created interesting strategic challenges that required creative solutions. But nothing about my circumstances was normal. Every paragraph I wrote felt labored and unclear. Charts and graphs that should have been persuasive looked amateurish and confusing. The presentation I was cobbling together bared no resemblance to the polished strategic materials I typically produced.
At 12:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the Solar Bridge team was due to arrive, I admitted defeat. The presentation wasn't ready, I wasn't ready, and continuing to pretend otherwise would only make things worse. I called David and asked him to handle the meeting, claiming that my bug had gotten worse and I didn't want to risk infecting potential clients. It was the first time in my career that I'd backed down from a professional commitment, and the failure felt devastating. Not because of the business implications, David was perfectly capable of handling the pitch meeting, but because it represented a fundamental crack in my self-image as someone who could handle anything. I spent the afternoon trying to salvage what I could of my other commitments. The Morrison materials were serviceable, though far below my usual standards. I managed to send Patricia Wellington a project timeline that covered all the essential elements, along with a brief note about having the detailed implementation plans ready by Wednesday. The EcoThread response required more creativity than I could muster, so I drafted something generic and scheduled it to send the following morning, hoping that a night's sleep would restore enough mental clarity to improve it before it went out. Connect Space's follow-up questions were the easiest to handle, mostly because I'd dealt with similar data breach scenarios for other clients. I could respond to their concerns almost automatically, drawing on established protocols and standard messaging frameworks. By 4 p.m., I'd completed the bare minimum required to keep my clients from panicking, but I felt no satisfaction in the accomplishment. Everything I'd produced that day was substandard, rushed, lacking the strategic insight and creative thinking that had built my reputation at Richardson and Associates. Worse, the physical symptoms were intensifying. The chest pressure had become impossible to ignore, and my left arm ached constantly. I'd developed a strange sensation of impending doom that seemed to have no rational basis. Everything in my professional life was actually going well, despite the day's struggles. I decided to leave the office at 5:30 p.m., earlier than I'd departed in months. The walk home along Lake Michigan usually energized me, but today every step felt effortful. I stopped twice to rest on benches, telling myself I was just enjoying the spring weather, rather than acknowledging that I couldn't maintain my normal pace. My apartment felt like a refuge when I finally reached it. Hemingway greeted me with unusual enthusiasm, as if he sensed something was wrong. I collapsed on my couch without bothering to change out of my work clothes, too exhausted to even manage basic self-care routines. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since graduate school. I called in sick for the following day, not because I wanted to skip work, but because I genuinely didn't think I could perform at an acceptable level. The admission felt like defeat, but it also felt necessary. I spent Tuesday at home, mostly sleeping and trying to convince myself that rest would solve whatever was wrong with me. I managed to eat some soup and crackers, my first real meal in days. I answered a few urgent emails, but ignored everything else, telling myself that one day of recovery would restore my normal capabilities. Wednesday morning, I felt marginally better. The chest pressure was still there, but it seemed manageable.
My thinking was clearer than it had been on Monday, though still not as sharp as usual. I returned to the office determined to prove that my Monday struggles had been an anomaly, not a pattern. But as I settled at my desk and opened my laptop, I realized that something fundamental had changed. The confidence that had always carried me through difficult challenges was gone, replaced by a persistent anxiety about my ability to meet the standards I'd set for myself. The Morrison Pharmaceuticals account, which had felt like my greatest triumph just 5 days earlier, now loomed as an impossible burden. Patricia Wellington's expectations were unchanged, but my capacity to meet them felt diminished in ways I couldn't explain or overcome through willpower alone. For the first time in my career, I wondered if I'd finally encountered a challenge that was beyond my abilities. Not because the work was too difficult, but because I was no longer the person who had confidently taken on that work in the first place. The realization was terrifying and humbling in equal measure. I'd built my entire adult identity around professional competence and personal resilience. If those qualities were failing me, then who was I? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? The answers to those questions would come sooner than I expected in ways that would make my Monday morning struggles seem trivial by comparison. The wake-up call came at 2:47 a.m. on Thursday morning. Not from my alarm clock, but from my own body staging a full revolt. I jolted awake with pain radiating from my chest down my left arm, accompanied by a crushing sensation that made it impossible to take a full breath. For 30 terrifying seconds, I lay in bed, wondering if I was dying. The pain subsided gradually, leaving me soaked in cold sweat and trembling. This wasn't stress. This wasn't exhaustion. This was something serious enough that even my stubborn determination couldn't dismiss it as a minor inconvenience. As dawn broke over Chicago, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. I was going to see a doctor. Dr. Rachel Martinez at Northwestern Memorial's urgent care clinic was younger than I'd expected, with kind eyes and the sort of competent manner that immediately put me at ease. After describing my symptoms, the chest pressure, arm pain, cognitive difficulties, and persistent fatigue, she ordered an EKG, blood tests, and a chest x-ray. "Your symptoms are concerning for someone your age," she said while reviewing the initial results. "The EKG shows some irregularities, and your troponin levels are slightly elevated. I want to keep you for observation and run some additional tests." The word observation sent a spike of panic through me. I can't stay. I have client meetings today, deadlines to meet. Can't we just figure out what's wrong and treat it quickly? Dr. Martinez fixed me with a look that was both sympathetic and firm. "Ms. Half, when someone your age presents with these symptoms, we take it very seriously. Heart disease in young women is often underdiagnosed because patients and sometimes even doctors assume it's impossible. But stress, genetics, lifestyle factors, they can all contribute to cardiac issues regardless of age." The next 6 hours passed in a blur of medical tests and mounting anxiety. Not anxiety about my health, I was still convinced this would turn out to be something minor and easily treatable, but anxiety about the work piling up in my absence. I'd already missed a conference call with EcoThread, postponed a strategy session for Connect Space, and failed to respond to 3 urgent emails from Patricia Wellington. Between tests, I tried to work from my phone, responding to messages and reviewing documents on the tiny screen. A nurse named Jennifer kept encouraging me to rest, but I couldn't explain that rest felt more dangerous than activity. If I stopped working, even temporarily, the carefully balanced ecosystem of my professional life might collapse entirely. The echocardiogram revealed the first concrete evidence that something was genuinely wrong. Dr. Martinez pointed to areas on the screen where my heart muscle wasn't functioning normally, explaining that this could indicate either recent damage or an ongoing condition that had been developing silently. "I'm recommending you see a cardiologist. Dr. Michael Park is excellent, and I can get you an appointment for tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I want you to take these medications and avoid any strenuous activity." The prescription bag she handed me contained 3 different medications, something for blood pressure, something for cholesterol, and something to prevent blood clots. The reality of my situation began to sink in as I stared at the pharmacy labels. This wasn't a temporary setback that could be fixed with rest and better time management. This was a chronic condition that would require ongoing medical care and lifestyle changes. The ride home in the taxi gave me time to process what I'd learned and, more importantly, what I needed to do about it. The immediate challenge was managing my clients' expectations while dealing with an uncertain medical timeline. But the larger challenge was accepting that my approach to work and life might need fundamental revision. I spent Thursday evening doing something I'd never done before, creating realistic timelines based on my actual capacity rather than my ambitions. Instead of promising Patricia Wellington comprehensive campaign materials by the end of the week, I outlined a phased approach that would deliver essential elements first and add complexity gradually. Instead of trying to handle 3 major accounts simultaneously, I identified tasks that could be delegated or postponed. The hardest part was calling David and Maria to explain the situation. I'd never shared personal problems with colleagues before, viewing professional and private life as completely separate spheres. But I needed help, and they were the only people who understood the specifics of my work well enough to provide meaningful assistance. I've been having some health issues, I told David during a Friday morning phone call. Nothing life-threatening, but I need to adjust my workload for a few weeks while doctors figure out what's going on. His response surprised me with its immediate warmth and concern. Of course. What do you need? I can take over Connect Space completely, and Maria's been asking for more responsibility. We can redistribute things however works best for your recovery. You do that? The question slipped out before I could stop it, revealing more vulnerability than I had intended. Isabel, you've been carrying an impossible load for months. We've all been worried about you burning out. This isn't about doing you a favor. This is about the team functioning sustainably. Maria's reaction was equally supportive, though characteristically more direct. Thank God you're finally admitting you're human, she said when I called her later. I've been watching you run yourself into the ground, and it's been terrifying. What kind of help do you need, and how can we make sure you actually rest instead of trying to work from your hospital bed? Their support felt foreign, but deeply reassuring.
The cardiology appointment with Dr. Park provided more answers and more questions. The comprehensive testing revealed evidence of coronary artery disease, unusual for someone my age, but not impossible given my family history, stress levels, and lifestyle factors I'd been ignoring for years. This isn't immediately life-threatening, Dr. Park explained, but it's a serious condition that requires ongoing management. The good news is that we caught it early, and there are excellent treatment options. The challenging news is that you'll need to make significant changes to how you approach work and stress. He prescribed additional medications and recommended cardiac rehabilitation, a structured program that would teach me how to exercise safely and manage stress more effectively. Most importantly, he emphasized that my recent symptoms were my body's way of warning me about a condition that had probably been developing for years. Young professionals often ignore early warning signs, he said. They assume that willpower can overcome physical limitations. But the cardiovascular system doesn't respond to determination. It responds to appropriate care and realistic expectations. Leaving his office, I felt simultaneously relieved and overwhelmed. Relieved to have a diagnosis and treatment plan, but overwhelmed by the implications for my carefully constructed life. Everything I'd built in Chicago was predicated on my ability to outwork competitors and exceed client expectations through sheer effort and long hours. If that approach was literally endangering my health, then who was I professionally? The weekend gave me time to experiment with a different approach to work and life. Instead of spending Saturday at the office, I worked from home for just 4 hours, focusing on high-priority tasks for Morrison Pharmaceuticals. Instead of pushing through fatigue and chest discomfort, I took breaks when my body demanded them. The results were a revelation. The
The work I produced in those 4 focused hours was better than what I'd been generating during 12-hour days in the office. Without the distraction of proving my dedication through visible effort, I could concentrate on strategic thinking and creative problem solving. Sunday, I did something I hadn't done in months. I spent the entire day away from work. I walked along the lakefront, read a novel, called my sister Ashley just to chat rather than out of familial obligation. The chest pressure that had been my constant companion for weeks began to ease slightly. Most surprisingly, I discovered that I enjoyed aspects of myself that had nothing to do with professional achievement. I'd forgotten that I liked cooking, that I found satisfaction in organizing my living space, that I could have conversations about topics other than marketing strategies and client challenges. By Monday morning, I felt more rested than I had in months, though still far from my previous energy levels. I arrived at the office with a revised approach. I would focus on quality over quantity, collaboration over competition, sustainability over short-term heroics. The test of this new approach came immediately. Patricia Wellington had called an emergency meeting about negative coverage in the Wall Street Journal, and she expected Richardson and Associates to provide immediate crisis management. The old Isabel would have canceled everything else and worked through the night to develop a comprehensive response. The new Isabel called David and Maria, explained the situation, and asked for help developing a collaborative response. Together, we created a more thoughtful strategy than I could have developed alone, and we completed it in half the time I would have needed working independently. For the first time since starting at Richardson and Associates, I began to understand that my value wasn't just individual competence, but my ability to work effectively with others to achieve shared goals. It was a lesson I should have learned years earlier, but I'd been too focused on proving my independence to recognize the strength that comes from interdependence. The irony wasn't lost on me that it took a health crisis to teach me how to work more effectively and live more sustainably. But as I adjusted to my new reality, I began to suspect that this forced adaptation might lead to better outcomes than my previous approach ever could have achieved.
3 weeks into my new approach to work and health management, something unexpected happened. I started getting better results than ever before. The Morrison Pharmaceuticals campaign, which I was now managing with David and Maria as true partners rather than subordinates, was exceeding every performance metric we'd established. Media coverage had shifted from 89% negative to 67% positive. Stock price had recovered 15% of its previous losses. Most importantly, Patricia Wellington was impressed enough to recommend Richardson and Associates to 2 other pharmaceutical companies facing similar challenges. The success should have validated my new collaborative approach, but instead, it created a different kind of pressure. Word was spreading throughout the company about the Morrison turnaround, and senior partners were taking notice. Tom Richardson himself, the firm's founding partner, who rarely involved himself in day-to-day operations, requested a meeting to discuss my innovative team leadership model. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m. in Richardson's corner office, a space I'd only seen once before, during my initial job interview. The invitation felt like the professional recognition I'd been working toward for 2 years, but it also felt dangerous. Success at Richardson and Associates typically meant increased responsibility, bigger clients, longer hours, exactly the trajectory that had nearly destroyed my health. I spent Wednesday evening preparing for the meeting, but this time my preparation looked different. Instead of working until midnight crafting the perfect presentation, I reviewed our results with David and Maria, asking for their perspectives on what had made our collaboration so effective. Instead of claiming individual credit for the success, I planned to emphasize the team elements that had actually driven our improved performance. "You know this is about the promotion, right?" Maria said as we wrapped up our planning session. "Richardson doesn't call junior associates into his office to chat about teamwork philosophy. He's sizing you up for senior associate, maybe even junior partner track." The possibility had occurred to me, but I'd been trying not to think about it. The promotion I'd wanted so desperately 6 months ago now felt complicated.
Senior associates at Richardson and Associates typically managed 5 or 6 major accounts simultaneously. They worked 70-hour weeks as a matter of course. They traveled constantly, attended networking events every weekend, and measured their success by revenue generation and client acquisition. It was everything I'd thought I wanted, and everything Dr. Park had warned me against. Thursday morning, I arrived at the office early and spent an hour in the small meditation room the company had recently added to their wellness initiatives. The irony of using corporate wellness resources to prepare for a conversation about career advancement wasn't lost on me, but the 20 minutes of focused breathing helped center my thoughts and clarify my priorities. Tom Richardson's office was exactly what I'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River, awards and accolades covering one wall, a massive desk that probably cost more than my annual rent. Richardson himself was in his early 60s, with the sort of confident bearing that comes from 40 years of professional success. "Isabel," he said, standing to shake my hand, "I've been hearing remarkable things about your work on the Morrison account. Patricia Wellington specifically mentioned your strategic thinking and execution capabilities. That's not praise she gives lightly." We spent the first 10 minutes reviewing the Morrison results in detail. Richardson was particularly interested in our crisis response timeline and the media placement strategy we'd developed for the congressional hearing preparation. His questions were incisive and demonstrated a thorough understanding of both our approach and its effectiveness. "What I find most interesting," he said, leaning back in his chair, "is that your results improved significantly after you began collaborating more extensively with Chen and Rodriguez. Most of our top performers are individual contributors who occasionally delegate routine tasks. You seem to have developed a genuinely collaborative model." This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the opportunity to explain how my health crisis had forced me to discover more effective ways of working. But Richardson's tone suggested he was more interested in replicating successful strategies than understanding their personal origins. "The pharmaceutical industry is particularly complex," I said carefully. "Morrison's challenges required expertise in crisis communications, social media strategy, traditional media relations, and regulatory affairs. No individual consultant, regardless of their skills, could have addressed all those areas with equal sophistication." "Agreed, which is why I'm recommending you for immediate promotion to senior associate, with leadership responsibility for our new pharmaceutical specialty group." The offer was everything I dreamed of and everything I now feared. Senior associate meant a 40% salary increase, equity participation, and recognition as one of the firm's rising stars. Leading the pharmaceutical group meant working with the industry's biggest companies on their most challenging problems. It was the fast track to junior partner and eventually to building my own client base. It was also exactly the kind of high-pressure, high-stakes responsibility that had triggered my health crisis in the first place. "That's an incredible opportunity," I said, buying time to think through my response. "Can you tell me more about the time expectations and client load for the pharmaceutical group leader?"
Richardson's description confirmed my concerns. The position would require managing relationships with 6 major pharmaceutical companies, overseeing a team of 12 consultants, and personally handling the most sensitive crisis communications work. Travel would be extensive, at least 2 weeks per month visiting clients across the country. The expectation was that I'd be available to clients 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. "I know it sounds demanding," Richardson acknowledged, "but you've proven you can handle complex challenges while maintaining exceptional quality standards. And the compensation reflects the demands. You'd be earning more than most 35-year-olds in comparable positions." As he spoke, I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that I'd learned to recognize as a warning sign. Not acute enough to be dangerous, but persistent enough to remind me that my body was still fragile, still recovering from months of abuse disguised as professional dedication. "I'm honored by the offer," I said slowly. "Could I have some time to think it through? This would be a significant change in my role and responsibilities." Richardson's expression shifted slightly, and I could sense his surprise. In his experience, ambitious junior associates didn't ask for time to consider promotions. They accepted immediately and figured out the details later. Of course, he said, though his tone had cooled. Take the weekend, but I should mention that we have other candidates we're considering, and pharmaceutical clients don't wait for consultants to sort out their personal priorities. The implied ultimatum was clear. Accept the promotion enthusiastically or risk being seen as lacking the commitment necessary for advancement at Richardson and Associates. It was the kind of binary choice that had driven most of my major life decisions. Choose career advancement or accept professional stagnation. But this time, I had additional factors to consider. My health, obviously, but also the relationships I'd built with David and Maria. The satisfaction I'd discovered in collaborative work, and the growing awareness that sustainable success might require different choices than rapid advancement. I spent Thursday afternoon walking along the lakefront, thinking through the implications of both choices. Accepting the promotion would validate every sacrifice I'd made since moving to Chicago, but it would also require sacrifices I wasn't sure I could make without destroying the progress I'd made in managing my health. Declining the promotion would mean acknowledging that my career ambitions needed to be modified by physical limitations, a concession that felt like admitting defeat after years of proving that I could compete with anyone, regardless of personal circumstances. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my sister, Ashley, for advice. Not because I was ready to move back to Nebraska or abandon my Chicago life, but because I needed perspective from someone who knew me before I defined myself entirely through professional achievement. It sounds like you're asking whether you want to be successful or happy, Ashley said, after I'd explained the situation. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe you should be asking what success actually means to you now. Her observation crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate. The promotion represented success as I defined it in my 20s. Advancement, recognition, financial reward, competitive achievement. But my health crisis had introduced different criteria: sustainability, collaboration, personal fulfillment, work-life integration. The challenge was that Richardson and Associates, like most high-level consulting firms, operated on the assumption that true professionals chose career advancement over personal considerations. Hesitating about a promotion suggested divided loyalty and questionable commitment. Friday morning brought an unexpected development that would influence my decision in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Patricia Wellington called with news that Morrison Pharmaceuticals was facing a new crisis. A whistleblower had released internal documents suggesting the company had hidden data about side effects for one of their diabetes medications. We need immediate crisis response, full communications lockdown, media strategy, congressional preparation, legal coordination, everything we discussed in your original presentation, but accelerated and intensified. The old Isabel would have seen this as an opportunity to prove her worth under ultimate pressure. The new Isabel saw it as a test of whether her collaborative approach could handle genuinely high-stakes situations. We'll have a preliminary response strategy within 4 hours, I told Patricia. But I want to be clear. This will require our full pharmaceutical team working together. David Chen will handle media coordination, Maria Rodriguez will manage social media response, and I'll focus on overall strategy and client communication. I don't care how you organize internally, Patricia replied. I need results, and I need them immediately. The next 6 hours would determine not just whether my new approach to work was sustainable under pressure, but whether I had the strength, physical and emotional, to handle the biggest professional challenge of my career while maintaining the health boundaries I'd finally learned to respect. The crisis response for Morrison Pharmaceuticals consumed the next 48 hours of my life in ways that made my previous work marathons seem leisurely by comparison. The whistleblower documents contained 3 years of internal emails suggesting that Morrison executives knew about increased heart attack risks for their diabetes medication glucostable, but had delayed reporting the data to the FDA while continuing to market the drug as heart-safe. By Saturday morning, the story had exploded across every major news platform. The congressional committee that had been preparing to question Morrison about drug pricing was now demanding emergency hearings about patient safety. The FDA announced they were launching an immediate investigation. 3 major law firms had already filed class action lawsuits on behalf of patients who'd suffered cardiac events while taking glucostable. Patricia Wellington was in full panic mode, calling our team every 2 hours with new developments and increasingly desperate demands for solutions. "This isn't just about reputation anymore," she told me during a 6 a.m. conference call on Sunday. "This could destroy the company entirely. We need a miracle, and we need it by Monday morning." The old me would have locked myself in the office for the entire weekend, surviving on coffee and adrenaline while crafting a comprehensive crisis response plan. But I'd learned enough about my physical limitations to know that approach would be disastrous. Instead, David, Maria, and I had been working in shifts, each taking responsibility for different aspects of the crisis while ensuring that someone was always available to handle emergencies. The collaborative approach was working beautifully from a strategic standpoint. We were producing higher quality work more efficiently than I ever could have managed alone. But it wasn't working from a client management perspective. Patricia Wellington had hired Richardson and Associates expecting a single point of contact who would be personally responsible for saving her company. She wanted to speak directly with the person in charge, not coordinate with a team. "I don't understand why I keep getting transferred between different people," she complained during Sunday afternoon's status call. "I hired Isabel Half specifically because of her presentation and strategic thinking. Where is she when we need her most?" The complaint stung because it highlighted a fundamental mismatch between my new sustainable approach and client expectations for crisis consulting. In high-stakes situations, clients didn't want balanced work-life integration. They wanted total dedication from consultants who would prioritize their problems above everything else, including personal health and well-being. Monday morning brought the news that would transform a manageable crisis into a catastrophic setback. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a cardiologist at Johns Hopkins, had published a preliminary analysis suggesting that the heart attack risks associated with glucostable might be even higher than the whistleblower documents indicated. Her research suggested that the medication could increase cardiac event risk by up to 40% in patients with pre-existing conditions. The market response was immediate and brutal. Morrison's stock price dropped 31% in the first hour of trading. 3 more law firms announced class action suits. The FDA issued a statement they were considering an immediate recall of all glucostable products pending their investigation. Patricia Wellington arrived at our office at 9:30 a.m., accompanied by Morrison's general counsel and their head of regulatory affairs. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, and her usual composed demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled panic. "We need a complete strategic overhaul," she announced as we gathered in conference room A. "Everything we've been doing is inadequate for the current situation. I need new messaging, new media strategy, new everything, and I need it implemented immediately." I had prepared for this meeting by reviewing our crisis response protocols and identifying 3 possible strategic directions, each appropriate for different levels of legal and regulatory exposure. But as Patricia spoke, I realized she wasn't interested in measured strategic options. She wanted bold action that would somehow reverse weeks of devastating news coverage and restore public confidence overnight. "What we're facing now requires a completely different approach than drug pricing concerns," I explained. "Patient safety issues are more serious, and they require more careful messaging. We can't appear to minimize legitimate health concerns, but we can position Morrison as cooperating fully with investigations and taking appropriate action."
"Appropriate action?" Patricia's voice rose sharply. "Isabel, we're fighting for the company's survival. Appropriate action is whatever it takes to prevent complete collapse. I don't want careful messaging. I want aggressive counter-narratives that shift blame to the FDA, the researchers, the lawyers who are exploiting this situation." Her demands were ethically problematic and strategically dangerous, but they also reflected the desperation of someone watching their company face potential bankruptcy. I found myself in the uncomfortable position of having to choose between giving the client what they wanted and maintaining professional standards that protected both Morrison's long-term interests and my own integrity. "I understand the pressure you're facing," I said carefully, "but aggressive counternarratives could backfire spectacularly. If we appear to be attacking researchers or minimizing patient concerns, we'll lose all credibility with the audiences we need to influence." "Then find another approach," Patricia snapped. "You presented yourself as someone who could handle impossible situations. This is your impossible situation. Handle it." The meeting continued for 3 hours, with Patricia rejecting every strategic recommendation that didn't promise immediate, dramatic results. She wanted us to organize counter-research that would challenge Dr. Walsh's findings. She wanted social media campaigns that would discredit the whistleblower's motives. She wanted media interviews where Morrison executives would categorically deny any wrongdoing, despite the documented evidence. Each demand put me in an increasingly difficult position. Professionally, I understood her desperation. Morrison Pharmaceuticals was facing an existential crisis that threatened thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in market value. But personally, I couldn't recommend strategies that might harm patients or destroy my own credibility in the pharmaceutical consulting industry. By noon, it was clear that Patricia and I had fundamentally different ideas about crisis management ethics and effectiveness. She viewed the situation as a war where any tactics were justified if they achieved victory. I viewed it as a complex problem requiring careful navigation of competing interests and long-term reputation considerations. "I'm starting to think you're not the right consultant for this situation," Patricia said as the meeting concluded. "Maybe you're too cautious for the kind of aggressive response we need." Her words felt like a professional death sentence. Richardson and Associates had built their reputation on client satisfaction and results delivery. If Patricia Wellington concluded that I was inadequate for handling her company's crisis, word would spread quickly throughout the pharmaceutical industry. Other potential clients would question my capabilities. The promotion Tom Richardson had offered would disappear. My career trajectory at the firm would be permanently damaged. That afternoon, I received an email that confirmed my worst fears. Tom Richardson requested an immediate meeting to discuss client concerns about my performance on the Morrison account. The email was copied to David and Maria, suggesting that our collaborative approach was being questioned. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday morning, less than 24 hours to figure out how to salvage a situation that felt increasingly hopeless. Patricia Wellington wanted strategies I couldn't ethically recommend. Tom Richardson wanted client satisfaction that seemed impossible to achieve. My health couldn't handle the kind of work marathon that might bridge the gap between what was expected and what was sustainable. That evening, I sat in my apartment, staring at the Morrison case files scattered across my dining table. Hemingway had knocked several documents onto the floor, as if expressing his opinion about the situation. For the first time since my health crisis began, I wondered if I'd made a fundamental mistake in trying to balance professional success with personal well-being. Maybe Patricia Wellington was right. Maybe crisis consulting required the kind of total commitment that left no room for sustainable work practices. Maybe my collaborative approach was evidence of weakness rather than strategic thinking. Maybe the chest pains and fatigue I had been experiencing weren't warning signs to be respected, but obstacles to be overcome through determination and professional discipline. The doubt was corrosive and familiar, echoing the voice that had driven me to work 18-hour days and ignore physical symptoms for months. But now that voice was complicated by the knowledge of what those choices had cost me and what they might cost me again if I returned to my previous patterns. As I prepared for what might be the most important meeting of my career, I realized I was facing a choice that went beyond professional strategy. I was choosing between the person I'd been, driven, successful, and nearly destroyed by my own ambitions, and the person I was trying to become, sustainable, collaborative, and committed to both professional excellence and personal health. The problem was, Tuesday's meeting with Tom Richardson would determine whether the person I was trying to become had any future at Richardson and Associates, and if the answer was no, I wasn't sure who I would be or what I would do next.
Tuesday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. I woke up at 5 a.m., my chest already tight with anxiety about the meeting with Tom Richardson. The previous night's restless sleep had been filled with dreams about career catastrophe and professional humiliation. As I prepared for what might be my last day at Richardson and Associates, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to tell the truth, regardless of the consequences. I arrived at the office at 7:15 a.m. and spent an hour preparing not just for Richardson's meeting, but for the possibility that I might need to resign by the end of the day. I organized my client files, updated project status reports for David and Maria, and drafted transition documents that would allow someone else to handle my remaining responsibilities. The irony wasn't lost in me that I was preparing for professional failure using the collaborative, sustainable approach that had gotten me into the situation in the first place. At 9 a.m. sharp, I walked into Tom Richardson's office carrying a folder containing everything Patricia Wellington had demanded, everything I'd refused to provide, and a detailed explanation of why ethical crisis management required different strategies than she wanted to pursue. I was prepared to defend my choices, accept responsibility for the client relationship failure, and maintain my professional integrity even if it cost me my career. Richardson was seated behind his massive desk, reviewing what appeared to be client feedback reports. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Isabel, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." His tone was neither warm nor cold, professionally neutral in a way that revealed nothing about his intentions. "Before we discuss Patricia Wellington's concerns," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk, "I want to be completely transparent about my approach to the Morrison account and why I made the choices I did." For the next 20 minutes, I walked Richardson through every strategic decision I had made, every recommendation I'd refused to provide, and every ethical consideration that had guided my work. I explained why aggressive counter-narratives would have backfired, why attacking researchers would have destroyed Morrison's credibility, and why collaborative crisis management actually produced better results than individual heroism. Richardson listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes, but mostly just observing my presentation with the kind of focused attention that had made him successful for 4 decades. "Isabel, Patricia Wellington believes you lack the aggressive instincts necessary for high-stakes crisis management. She specifically requested that we assign a different lead consultant to the Morrison account." The words hit like a physical blow, confirming everything I'd feared about the meeting's outcome. But instead of the panic I had expected, I felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was finally out, and whatever happened next would at least be based on honest assessment rather than professional performance theater. "I understand," I said quietly. "I know my approach doesn't match traditional crisis consulting expectations." "No, it doesn't, which is why I'm not reassigning the Morrison account." I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry." Richardson leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to something approaching paternal concern. "Isabel, I've been in this business for 42 years. I've seen hundreds of consultants handle thousands of crises. The vast majority follow exactly the playbook Patricia Wellington wanted you to use: aggressive messaging, attacking critics, minimizing problems, and prioritizing short-term reputation over long-term credibility." He pulled out a different file, this one containing what appeared to be industry reports and competitor analysis. "Do you know what happened to the last 3 consulting firms that handled pharmaceutical crises using those aggressive tactics? Morrison's previous firm, Henderson and Associates, went out of business after their aggressive defense of a different pharmaceutical company backfired spectacularly. Their client ended up paying $2.3 billion in settlements, and Henderson lost 60% of their client base." I sat in stunned silence as Richardson continued. "The pharmaceutical industry is changing. Patients are more informed, regulators are more aggressive, and the media is less willing to accept corporate spin. Companies need consultants who understand that sustainable reputation management requires ethical approaches and long-term thinking, not just short-term damage control." But Patricia Wellington specifically said, "Patricia Wellington is terrified and desperate. She's facing the biggest crisis of her career, and her instinct is to fight back with everything she has. That's understandable, but it's not strategic. Your recommendations were correct, even if they weren't what she wanted to hear." The revelation was so unexpected that I struggled to process its implications. I had spent the past week convinced that my ethical approach was a professional liability, only to discover that Richardson viewed it as a competitive advantage. What happens now? Now we implement your crisis strategy properly with full firm support and clear communication to Patricia Wellington about why ethical crisis management serves Morrison's interests better than aggressive counterattacks. He stood and walked to his window overlooking the Chicago River, his hands clasped behind his back. There's something else we need to discuss, your health situation. My chest tightened with familiar anxiety. I had been so focused on the professional implications of my work approach that I'd barely considered how my medical issues might affect Richardson's decision-making. David Chen and Maria Rodriguez came to see me last week. They were concerned about your workload and wanted to make sure you were getting appropriate support. They also mentioned that your collaborative approach had emerged from some personal health challenges. The betrayal stung initially. I had trusted David and Maria with personal information, and they had shared it with senior management without my permission. But as Richardson continued talking, I realized their motivation had been protective rather than undermining. Consulting is a demanding profession that historically rewards people who sacrifice everything for client success. But that model is unsustainable, literally. We've lost too many talented consultants to burnout, health problems, and personal crises. Your approach suggests that there might be a better way. He returned to his desk and pulled out yet another file, this one containing what appeared to be industry wellness data and industry retention statistics. Richardson & Associates has a 23% annual turnover rate. Our consultants average 58 hours per week and take less vacation time than any other professional services firm in Chicago. We have excellent client satisfaction scores, but we're burning through human capital at an unsustainable pace. The conversation was taking yet another unexpected turn. Instead of discussing my professional future, Richardson was analyzing company-wide workforce management issues. I want you to lead a pilot program, a new approach to high-stakes consulting that prioritizes both client results and consultant sustainability. Your Morrison work suggests it's possible to achieve better outcomes while maintaining healthier work practices. The offer was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. Richardson was essentially asking me to revolutionize consulting methodology based on lessons I'd learned from my own near collapse. It was the kind of professional opportunity I had dreamed about, but it was also exactly the kind of high-pressure, high-stakes responsibility that had triggered my health crisis in the first place.
I'm honored by the offer, I said carefully, but I need to be honest about my limitations. I can't work 70-hour weeks anymore. I need to maintain regular medical appointments and stress management practices. I need to collaborate with colleagues rather than handling everything independently. Good, Richardson said simply. Those aren't limitations. They're the foundation of the approach I want you to develop and teach to other consultants. At 11:47 a.m., as I was walking back to my desk to call Patricia Wellington and explain our refined strategy for Morrison Pharmaceuticals, my body staged its final, definitive protest against months of accumulated stress and overwork. The pain started as a crushing sensation in the center of my chest, unlike anything I had experienced during my previous episodes. It radiated down both arms and up into my jaw, accompanied by nausea and a sense of impending doom so profound that I knew immediately this was different from stress or anxiety. I made it 3 steps from Richardson's office before collapsing onto the hallway floor. Maria found me first. "Isabel! Oh my God, someone call 911. David appeared within seconds, kneeling beside me and checking my pulse while Maria grabbed the phone. Other colleagues gathered around, their faces blurred by pain and confusion, but I could hear their voices clearly. "Stay with us, Isabel. Help is coming. Should we call her family? Does anyone have her emergency contacts?" The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, 2 efficient professionals who immediately began assessing my condition and preparing me for transport. As they worked, one of them asked for my emergency contact information. "My parents," I managed to gasp between waves of pain. "Robert and Linda Half in Kearney, Nebraska." I gave them the phone number, certain that my parents would be on the next flight to Chicago. Despite our strained relationship, despite the years of mutual disappointment and misunderstanding, family was family.
Crisis had a way of clarifying priorities and bringing people together when it truly mattered. But they didn't come. The paramedic who'd called them found me in the emergency room 3 hours later, his expression uncomfortable. "Miss Half, I spoke with your mother. She said they can't travel to Chicago right now because of work commitments, but they're thinking about you and hope you recover quickly. She asked me to tell you that your sister Ashley is planning to drive up this weekend if you're still in the hospital." The words hit harder than the heart attack itself. In the moment when I needed them most, when I was genuinely scared and completely vulnerable, my family had chosen to stay home. Work commitments. As if my mother's third-grade classroom couldn't function without her for 2 days. As if my father's grain elevator responsibilities took priority over their daughter's cardiac emergency. But as I lay in that hospital bed, processing the reality of my family's absence, I realized I wasn't alone. David had taken the afternoon off to sit in the waiting room, handling my client calls and ensuring that the Morrison crisis response continued smoothly. Maria had brought me books, magazines, and updates on office gossip to keep my spirits up. Tom Richardson had personally called the hospital to check on my condition and assure me that my job would be waiting when I recovered. Dr. Sarah Chen, the Morrison Pharmaceuticals CMO I'd met only briefly during client presentations, had somehow heard about my hospitalization and sent flowers with a note that said, "Thank you for always putting patient safety first in your recommendations. Get well soon. The industry needs more consultants with your integrity." Even Patricia Wellington, despite our recent conflicts, had sent a card acknowledging that my ethical approach to her company's crisis had been correct, even if it hadn't been what she had wanted to hear at the time. Over the next 3 days in the cardiac care unit, I received visits from colleagues I barely knew, emails from clients I had worked with months earlier, and messages from competitors who'd heard about my hospitalization through industry networks. People I'd never expected to care about my personal well-being had somehow become a support system I hadn't known existed. The contrast with my family's response was stark and illuminating. The people who shared my DNA had sent thoughts and prayers from a distance. The people who shared my professional world had shown up with presence, practical help, and genuine concern for my recovery. On Thursday afternoon, as I was preparing for discharge with a new medication regimen and strict instructions about lifestyle modifications, Maria knocked on my hospital room door. "Hey," she said, settling into the visitor's chair. "How are you feeling?" Like I got hit by a truck, but also strangely grateful. Grateful for the heart attack? Grateful for finding out who really shows up when everything falls apart. Maria nodded, understanding immediately what I meant. "Your colleagues care about you more than you realized, and my family cares about me less than I hoped." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the Chicago skyline through my hospital window. The city that had been my escape from family expectations had become my home in ways I'd never fully appreciated. "David and I have been talking," Maria said eventually, "about the pilot program Richardson wants you to lead. We want to help develop it, not just as your subordinates, but as true partners. We think we can create something that changes how consulting works, not just at Richardson and Associates, but industry-wide." The invitation felt like the missing piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve since my diagnosis. I'd learned that sustainable success required collaboration, but I'd never considered that collaboration could become the foundation for professional innovation rather than just personal survival. "There's one more thing," Maria said, pulling an envelope from her purse. "This came to the office yesterday." The envelope was addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the Johns Hopkins cardiologist whose research had escalated the Morrison crisis. "Dear Ms. Half, I heard about your hospitalization through colleagues in the pharmaceutical consulting industry, and I wanted to reach out personally. Your ethical approach to the Morrison Pharmaceuticals crisis, particularly your refusal to attack researchers or minimize patient safety concerns, represents exactly the kind of principled consulting the healthcare industry needs. I hope you recover quickly and continue to demonstrate that it's possible to serve clients effectively while maintaining professional integrity. The industry is better because of consultants like you. Wishing you good health and continued success. Dr. Jennifer Walsh."
Reading the letter, I realized that my heart attack had revealed something I'd never understood before: the difference between the family you're born with and the family you choose, between relationships based on obligation and relationships based on mutual respect and shared values. My parents had given me life, raised me with love, and provided the foundation that enabled my professional success, but they couldn't understand the person I'd become or support the choices I'd made to build a life that fulfilled me. My colleagues, people I'd known for months rather than decades, had seen me at my most vulnerable and responded with the kind of loyalty and care I'd always hoped to receive from my biological family. The heart attack at 28 was terrifying and life-altering, but it had also been clarifying. It had shown me that success wasn't about proving I could handle everything alone, but about building relationships with people who would help me handle things together. It had taught me that family isn't just about shared DNA, but about who shows up when you need them most. And it had revealed that the person I was becoming, collaborative, sustainable, ethically grounded, was not just personally healthier, but professionally more effective than the person I'd been trying so hard to be. As I prepared to leave the hospital and return to a life that would look fundamentally different from the one I'd been living just a week earlier, I felt something I hadn't experienced since moving to Chicago. I felt truly at home, not because of the city or the job or the apartment, but because of the people who had chosen to be part of my life and who I had chosen to trust with my authentic self. The heart attack at 28 was the worst thing that had ever happened to me. But it had also been the thing that finally taught me what really mattered. And for the first time in my adult life, I knew exactly who I was and exactly where I belonged.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.